Joining us now, former Republican governor of Ohio, John Kasich. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. So what do you make of Donald Trump's first visit back to, as Nancy Pelosi calls it, the scene of the crime?
Cheerleading. I think he's back there. And, I understand this morning the Republicans met in the Capitol Hill Club, which is a Republican hangout, and they were enthusiastic and standing ovations and hooting and hollering. And then he goes over to meet with the Senate, where there's less of that, but still it appears to be strong support. And it was his effort to just get up there and try to make some news. And apparently he's going to go and visit with some CEOs at the Business Roundtable. And, it's just a tour designed to attract some publicity, to show some strength, to show some unity. But, at the end of the day, you've got to wonder about the recent polls that show some slippage for him among independents and continued slippage among some Republicans. But, I think for him to go up there was a smart thing to do.
Let's bring in Jake Sherman of Punchbowl News. He's got some reporting for us on what happened inside that meeting. Jake, what can you tell us?
Yeah, it was a typical Donald Trump, Katie, in which, this was billed as Governor Kasich said, a moment of unity and a moment of getting on the same page for policy and a host of other things. That wasn't what it was about. It was a long kind of ramble about various things he likes and doesn't like and people he likes and doesn't like. He talked about Nancy Pelosi's daughter allegedly telling him that they would be good in a relationship or a good match, which one of Pelosi's daughters immediately said that's not true. He said, as has gotten a lot of publicity, and we broke this, that he doesn't like Milwaukee. It's a horrible city, he says. The campaign has pushed back on that, but it's amazing to see, Katie. All of the people in the room have a different explanation. Either he said it, he didn't say it, he said it, but he meant this, he said it, but he meant that. He was actually talking about the park in Milwaukee. I mean, Katie, you and I have been through this. I mean, it's kind of taking me back to 2020, 2019, 2018, and for you, earlier than that, in which people hear what they want from Trump, and it's all kind of all over the place.
I found it interesting that Senator Murkowski today was like, she feels like she's been thrown back into the heady days of the first administration, his first administration, where every day she was asked nonstop questions to react to whatever Donald Trump did or said that day. And she said the same thing happened to her today. She didn't seem to like it very much. Of course, Murkowski is one of the people that voted to convict him during the impeachment. How do Republicans feel about the prospect of having to go through that all over again, Jake?
Well, and it's different in the House than the Senate, right? In the House, you just have a bunch. I mean, nearly everybody in the House is 100% for Donald Trump, at least publicly, and will defend and stand up for literally anything he says and does, right? I mean, he said Milwaukee's a horrible city. Everybody comes out and says he didn't say it. Of course he said it. I mean, that is according to almost everybody in the room. But in the Senate, there's a little bit more skepticism about Donald Trump, about his policy preferences and motivations and his position on tariffs or on this or that or the other thing. But I will say, I mean, he made some points that a lot of Republicans don't agree with. For example, on abortion. He said that a couple minutes ago at the Senate meeting, he said that abortion was the reason Republicans lost seats in 2022. He then, in the meeting with House members, said that there should be exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother, which, by the way, is not a position that's held by every Republican in the House and Senate. So, again, we're seeing kind of this Trump vortex, what happens when Donald Trump kind of rolls into town. And that's the undeniable reality that every Republican every single day will be held to account for what Trump says, because what he says sometimes is A, controversial, and B, doesn't line up with what the rest of the party says or believes.
Let's play a little bit what Speaker Johnson said about the prospect of a potential second Donald Trump presidency.
We have to have continuity in leadership. We have to have a plan, and it has to be very carefully executed. When he became president for the first time in 2017, I was a freshman in Congress at the time, and a lot of people on Capitol Hill didn't expect that would be the eventuality. They didn't actually believe that we would have unified government where the Republican Party would control the White House, the Senate, and the House. And so we lost a few steps, frankly, in the beginning of that Congress, the 115th Congress, because the plan was not fully prepared and the implementation lagged a little bit. We're not going to make that mistake again.
So when Republicans hear that, they probably think Kasich, Governor Kasich, like, great, we're going to get a lot done. When Democrats hear that, they think, okay, well, Republicans want to get an abortion ban done. Maybe they'll do that. Republicans want to institute Donald Trump's policy to evict all of the so-called deep staters from the government and just install loyalists. They worry about that. They worry about what Donald Trump, whether there will be any lines in a second Donald Trump administration, and if there aren't any, how far might he go in Democrats' concern, destroying democracy? Governor, what do you see when you, or what do you hear when you hear Mike Johnson say that?
Well, look, Katie, I've spoken to some people who were in the first Trump administration and some who might be in a second Trump administration if there is one. Number one, I don't think the Republicans are going to hang on to the House. So this whole idea that they're going to have all the organs of government, I think, is not going to pan out to be the way they think it is. But secondly, when I talk to people who have been inside the administration and those who could be in again, take, for example, the matter of tariffs. I mean, there is significant disagreement among his advisors. I actually have talked to some who have said if they were to raise these tariffs up really high, that it would slow the economy down, could throw us into a recession. There's a long way from well, we know this. There's a long way from the rhetoric that we hear in a political campaign to what actually you do, actually the kind of policies that come from that. The issue of tariffs are one that, both sides are now, doubling down on tariffs. But at the end of the day, if you boost them too high, you can throw this country into a recession. And there will be people inside an administration who are going to try to hold the brakes on some of these things. How much influence they'll have or what it will be like, we don't know. And I think if you were to look inside the policies that were laid out here, I'm not talking about abortion or, the life of the rape, incest, the life of the mother. I think that's where the country is. But I'm talking about the, sort of the economic policies, the tariff policies, the foreign policies. There's a long way to go to understand what their specifics are. And again, there will be people in there who will say, no, we can't do that. So there'll be a tug of war.
Governor John Kasich, Jake Sherman, thank you guys very much.